All right, so with World War One over and nationalism continuing to be on the rise, here's what happened in Africa post World War One. Some were willing to go fight in the war, others were not. And when Wilson gives his post World War One plan with the 14 point, this gives hope to a lot of Africans. And however, the Europeans actually only hold on to their increase even more because they took a lot. The Allied powers took a lot of the colonies of the Germans, and so Europeans try to double down. And Europeans have a harder time hanging on to these colonies, though, because a lot of the Europeans have left. So, for instance, France wanted to get Cameroon back, but Britain wanted superiority, and so the German colonies at Togo, Cameroon, German Southwest Africa, Namibia, and German East Africa, we're going to start to work to fight against them. The Germans had used guerrilla tactics to try to keep their colonies in Africa, and even though the Africans were outnumbered 10 to 1, it was a problem. There was about 1 million Africans participated in the war. Some volunteered, some forced, others because of conscription. All of them as a whole were killing anybody who was white, and that's how they had seen it. And so 150,000 people had lost their power or lost their lives in that. European personnel are leaving in huge numbers to go fight in Europe or Africa, so Europeans had to try to European personnel is leaving in large numbers to go fight in Europe or in Africa. Europeans had to try to meet this demand. Most of the revolts come from the resentment and hatred for using African soldiers. And some even call for all-out war on all Europeans. So it didn't matter. British, French, German, it doesn't matter. And some even call for a massive pan-Islamic state in northern Africa. So what was set up here post-war is that Africa is going to become more integrated in the global economy. There's going to be huge export-based economies, new ports, new roads, new railways, telegraph lines, agriculture and mineral wealth gets linked to the outside world. However, Europeans are what's going to benefit from this. The people there aren't. So you have these huge cash crop farming to allow for more taxes to get paid. Like, for instance, peanuts in Senegal and Nigeria, cotton in Uganda, cocoa in the Gold Coast, rubber in Congo, and palm oil in Ivory Coast in Nigeria. Whites get all the benefits from this, though. Whites get all the benefits from this. And so, for instance, in South Africa, where 88% of the land in South Africa is owned by 20% of the population, that's going to be a problem. That's going to be a problem. So the colonized paid for everything that was a part of it, but yet all the benefits are going to the people outside of Africa. And this is somewhat similar to what we are then coming out of that. We see African nationalism. This starts to not go well because there had been a bunch of Africans that had gone and studied in Europe, the high-ranking civil servants, physicians, lawyers, writers. They had all studied in the West. So as the Europeans worked to consolidate their power around these export-based economies, that's going to start to change. These new elites, those urban intellectuals who had studied in Europe, are going to come back and they are going to start calling for African nationalism and independence from Africa. They understood their positions. These new urban elites, they would go back and forth playing the Europeans off of the people who had been suppressed in Africa. And it's going to go back and forth. The most famous one is Jomo Kenyatta. Jomo Kenyatta eventually will lead to an independent Kenya in East Africa, but he is going to play the Europeans off of each other until the point that he can lead a Kenyan independence movement, which will happen once we get out of World War II. Many people are embracing the call for nation states in Africa. This is going to be really hard because there were so many different ethnic groups there that have been combined under imperialism. And some want to unify under these pre-colonial ideas. Some are using race, some are using geography. For example, in America, W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey in Jamaica, are from the U.S. and Jamaica, respectively. They're actually calling for blacks in the U.S. and Jamaica to go back to Africa and to start to try to create new countries there. All right, so let's leave Africa. And next we're going to go to Latin America, which has some of similarities with Africa in that it is under neo-colonial rule, foreign economic domination. The U.S. and British completely dominate economically, and they are investing big time into the economic structures of Latin America. There is some political and some military interference, but for the most part, it's neocolonialism. There's increasing popularity of Marxism, Leninism. Protests are beginning in the 1920s and the 1930s. You're going to see protests, especially in Mexico, where representation within the educational system results in long-term politicalization of student bodies, and a new person is going to come. Fidel Castro is going to start to learn here, and he's going to start to learn the policies of Marxism, and eventually that will end up in Cuba. In universities and the college systems as a whole, again, these new beliefs are starting to spread, and they're going to start to spread in places like Peru, where in Peru you're going to start to see people, where you're going to start to see Jose Carlos, let's say, make sure I pronounce this right, Marigati, who's going to spread Marxism in Peru, where he reaches out and writes articles on behalf of the Indian population living in Peru. The Europeans are going to exile him, but when he comes back and he establishes a socialist Peru in 1928, you're going to start, you're looking here throughout that you're looking at new movements in Latin America where it's fighting against the colonizer. You're fighting against the colonizer with Marxism and Leninism. Diego Rivera is going to lead an art movement in Mexico where he is going to blend arts and political visions and celebrate Mexican art and pre-Columbian ideas. And he's actually going to paint in New York a lot. He's going to paint in New York a lot. However, shows the imperialism, shows the U.S. stock exchange handling guns and tanks while Latin American people are dying in the foreground, and really starts to question. And people in Latin America are questioning this economic imperialism that's going on. Because just like Africa, they have these export-based economies. The U.S. banks and businesses are taking their finances and they are sending them into Latin America. The U.S. went from $1.5 billion of investment to over $3 billion, and they are working to take over businesses. They're extracting copper and oil. And it's called Yankee imperialism. Dollars for bullets, dollar diplomacy, because Howard Taft, the U.S. president, is taking money and he's trying to develop these foreign markets, and he wants to avoid military intervention. However, there's a dramatic halt to this. The dramatic halt to this is in 1929. Depression hits. This 50 years of growth in Latin America is going to stop on a dime. Sugar from the Caribbean, coffee from Brazil and Colombia, wheat and beef from Argentina, tin from Bolivia, nitrates from Chile, and that is all just killed by the Depression. Just like every other place, unemployment's going to go up. Latin America does many similar things to what the U.S. does, where they're going to raise tariffs and restrict trade. Brazil is going to have a new government here where it's going to be backed by the military, and they're going to put tons of money into iron and steel. But also, just like what we'd seen elsewhere, so you do have a national industrial development of Brazil, a new military state basically. However, they are going to protect workers' rights, health, safety regulations, and also just in general, they're going to try to increase the ability of the worker to succeed. So part of this dollars for bullets and dollar diplomacy is that you will have U.S. military intervention in throughout Latin America. So you can see here, like, the U.S. is going to send troops into Cuba multiple times, Nicaragua plenty of times, and the control over the canal here. The U.S. does have control over the Panama Canal starting in 1904. So notice that, yes, the U.S. is intervening in tons of places. This is neocolonialism, economic control, but also then, hey, we're going to send our military in every once in a while. And a part of this is we do have these good neighbor policies where the U.S. is going to have cordial relationships with the countries down there. For instance, the U.S. Marines are going to provide training for the police forces. And what that does is we get the militaries a lot on our side, and the Guard leaders keep close ties with the U.S., and that allows for those sweetheart treaties, as they're called, that the U.S. interests are in Latin America is basically under control. Now, this is going to start to change, and the first place is going to be Nicaragua. Senandino, Augusto Cesar Senandino, he's a Nicaraguan nationalist. He wants the U.S. gone. He wants the U.S. gone. And so he works to set up and remove forces, so he sets up this National Guard in Nicaragua. So in an election in 1932, where Juan Batista Salazar is elected, the U.S. troops leave, and Somoza gets elected. Or I'm sorry, the U.S. troops leave. Amar Sargor is the commander of the Guard, and the National Guard then, as working under Sarandino, he gets murdered in 1934, and Somoza becomes president. In other words, U.S. friend becomes elected president, but Sarandino becomes a hero and a martyr because he's going to work against the U.S. And so the U.S. is going to start to lose their political way of things. Okay, the Monroe Doctrine was that the Western Hemisphere, that no state has the right to intervene in the internal or external affairs of each other. The U.S. is actually going to renounce that policy. That the oil industry in Mexico for a time is basically going to be owned by U.S. and Great British investors. And when Mexico nationalizes the oil industry, Roosevelt, FDR, Franklin Delano, refuses to send U.S. troops in. So in other words, at the end here, we're going to start to see more conflicts. U.S. economic imperialism is going to start to decrease a little bit because the U.S. will not send troops into Mexico. And U.S. companies are going to lose a ton of money. Now, the other thing down here increases Mexican cultural influences in America. Just there's more and more migrants from Mexico moving in. And there's also Chiquita Banana. And the reason I have Chiquita Banana down here is Chiquita Banana had a lot of power in Central America because as a company, a lot of these places have great banana plantations. A lot of these countries have great banana plantations, and the U.S. is going to back Chiquita Banana. And so what we see is we start to see, yes, in some places the U.S. is losing power, like in Mexico, but in other places their economic influence is only increasing. All right, so what should we realize? We should realize the connection between the two things here. Both of Africa and Latin America have export-based economies going on with growing nationalism. In Africa, you're going to have these new urban elites that are forming to push against them. And in Latin America, this dollars for bullets, dollar diplomacy, where the U.S. is putting their money in. When the Great Depression hits, the U.S. can't do that as much anymore. And so then they go to the good neighbor policy, which is more, hey, we're going to keep cordial relationships. We're going to train your police, etc., etc. But then you're going to have subtle changes over time where the Monroe Doctrine, Roosevelt Accord is reduced in 1933 because we won't go into Mexico to defend our economic interests.